All right. Hi, everyone. I am Dr. Jessica Parker, and tonight I'm going to talk to you about some common writing challenges, how to get unstuck, and how to transform your academic writing practice. And this webinar is scheduled for an hour, and we'll use most of that for the presentation, but we'll also have time for a Q&A at the end. So a little bit about me. If you're not one of our clients or a member of the Academic Writing Center, then you may not know me. I'm Dr. Jessica Parker. I'm the owner of Dissertation by Design and the Academic Writing Center. And I'm a healthcare researcher. My background is in healthcare research. Before I founded Dissertation by Design, I was a senior research director in Boston at Northeastern University School of Nursing and Harvard School of Dental Medicine. Since then, I've kind of moved on from academia. I started my company. I do still teach part-time. I teach Doctor of Health Sciences students. I'm a reviewer for several peer-reviewed journals, and I've authored about 11 peer-reviewed publications and secured several multi-million-dollar grants. So I do know a thing or two about academic writing. And I definitely know a lot about the different writing challenges that not just doctoral candidates encounter, but also early career faculty, because we do work with quite a few early career faculty, and even seasoned faculty experience a lot of the challenges that I'll talk with you about tonight. Tell you a little bit about my company so you can just understand kind of where I'm coming from in tonight's presentation, and then I'll move on. So Dissertation by Design is a company that I started about 5 years ago, and we help doctoral candidates primarily with research proposal development, qualitative data analysis, statistical analyses, and professional editing. And then earlier this year, I launched the Academic Writing Center after just hearing from hundreds of doctoral candidates and faculty at the universities where we partner, just kind of talking about the same issues or complaints, if you will, about the traditional university writing center model. And so I launched the Writing Center, and it's an academic writing community. We have weekly writing workshops and writing retreats. Some of you may have attended the writing retreats that we had last month to celebrate Academic Writing Month. And then we also have one-on-one writing support, and we have access to the same professional editors at Dissertation by Design. All right, so with that said, let's get started. So this is our agenda. We are going to talk about, not necessarily in this order, by the end of the presentation, I will have discussed all of these items, but we'll talk about common academic writing challenges. We'll talk about navigating self-doubt, perfectionism, loneliness, and overwhelm. Talk about different strategies for getting unstuck, and academic writing best practices. And if you see this little link on the screen, that means that there's an accompanying resource. I will send out all of the handouts and the recording together after tonight's webinar. So don't panic, you're not missing anything. I'll send everything out after this webinar is over. Okay, before I dive in to common challenges, in case you just joined us, please use the Q&A if you have a question or if you want to comment on something. Dr. Veronica Richard is a colleague of mine. She's our qualitative methodologist at Dissertation by Design, and she is manning the Q&A. And so, yeah, if you have any questions, just please add those there. And if we have time, she'll just kind of interrupt and let me address your questions in the moment. Otherwise, we're going to save everything until the end of the webinar. So, common challenges. I started out with a very long list of common challenges, and then I tried to distill them into these categories. So the first category really encompasses all the different feelings, attitudes, and beliefs you bring to the writing process. And I kind of narrowed those down to the most common ones that I see, which is the sense of negative authorial identity, feelings of loneliness and isolation, the planning fallacy trap, and then feedback, a lot of feelings and attitudes around feedback that we'll discuss. And then we have this other set of challenges that I filed under academic writing conventions and considerations. And we have organization and flow. So achieving good organization and flow in your writing is a common challenge. Also alignment, establishing novelty. So establishing like the need for your study. And then argumentation. So these are the common challenges I'm going to discuss. And The way I'm going to organize this webinar is I'll present a challenge, I'll talk about it for a moment, and then I'll present at least one, if not more, different strategies and writing practices that you could implement in order to address that challenge. So before we dive in, I would just love to hear from you in this kind of first category of the feelings, attitudes, and beliefs you bring to the writing process. Which of these do you experience most frequently? We have negative authorial identity, which is just having a sense of authority over your writing, loneliness and isolation, planning fallacy trap, and fear of feedback. Or if there's another one that stands out in your mind, feel free to choose other and then add it to the Q&A. Let me launch this poll. Great. You could answer the poll, that would be great. Yeah. A few more coming in, then I'll end the poll. Okay. Going to share the results so you can see. Okay. So negative authorial identity, only 10% of you. I would imagine that by the time we get through that section, more of you will identify with that. Loneliness and isolation, 38%. Planning fallacy, a good 33%, a third of you. Fear of feedback, I ended up changing that to just feedback in general because it's a little more than fear. There's some resistance to feedback we'll talk about. And then other. 8% of you put other. Veronica, I don't know if any of those are worth kind of shouting out, but I'd just be curious to know if there are other concerns that or challenges that might be worth mentioning.
Being a judge of one's own works. And then Ryan had said that he wasn't sure what a planning fallacy is, and I agreed with that, but then that's where I fall. That's what I would have chosen. Planning fallacy. Yeah. I way underestimate what the amount of time it's going to take.
Yeah, like for this webinar, for example, I started it 2 weeks ago, and then I thought, okay, I can knock this out in 2 days reasonably. And then I was in a rush to try to proofread and finish it. So really underestimating the amount of time it takes to complete a task, despite having evidence in the past of how long it takes you to complete the same task. So that's like the planning fallacy trap. But yeah, so it looks like a lot of you are in this camp of loneliness and isolation and the planning fallacy. Negative authorial identity, we're going to get into that first. And that encompasses quite a few things that we'll talk about. I actually have the most slides on that. So I'll be curious to know if, now that you know more about this, if you identify with it a bit more. But negative, so authorial identity in general is just a sense of authority over your writing. And so when you have a negative authorial identity, it's when you really don't have either little or no sense of authority over your writing. And it tends to lead to, there's quite a bit of research on this, it tends to lead to writing anxiety and low self-efficacy. And then interestingly, a lot of the research on authorial identity is around plagiarism. And I've put one source here, but there were many where they found this relationship, this positive relationship between when someone has when their authorial identity is negative, or is an inverse relationship, then they have higher incidences of plagiarism. And there's a lot of reasons why, but plagiarism isn't the only way that this can manifest. When we're looking at someone's writing, you can tend to pick up on this in a number of ways. When the writer is taking a neutral stance, so it seems like they don't really have an opinion on what they're interpreting, what they're reading, or what they're saying. Maybe there's little to no argumentation, a lot of passive voice, lack of synthesis, to just like reporting and describing results, and then too many quotations. When I see a ton of quotations and even block quotations, it really makes me feel that the writer isn't quite comfortable establishing their own voice, establishing their stance in their writing. And that's where the plagiarism can come in. And so when I say plagiarism, it's not necessarily intentional plagiarism. Sometimes it's definitely unintentional. And so these are the ways that it manifests. And something that I commonly hear about when I speak with clients and students, like I have several Doctor of Health Sciences students right now who are writing their lit reviews. And I hear a lot of the same things, and I would file them, these challenges, under this category. And it's, well, who am I to say that this finding is conflicting with this? I'm not an expert yet on this topic. Or I just started this process of learning how to read articles. How can I really be critical of this and point out limitations of someone else's research who clearly knows, what they're doing? And so those are all kind of signs as not really feeling that you yet have an academic voice and that you're not ready to establish authority in your writing. And it's really, really common with graduate students and even early career faculty. It is one of those things that just takes time to develop. But I think being aware of it and then knowing that there are ways to address it is extremely helpful. Because I find that someone just telling me it takes time makes me feel like there's nothing I can really do about it. And I don't like that. So I have some strategies for you. So according to Pitam et al., 2009, authorial identity is developed and strengthened through understanding audience and disciplinary conventions, writing with authority, and developing an academic voice. I'm like, okay, yes, but how? What does that really mean? How can we make this practical? And so I kind of looked at a lot of the literature and distilled it down into these very practical steps. And so one of them is just committing to your ideas and taking a stance in your writing. Most of us have opinions on many things in our life, but when we're writing as academics and we're proposing the need for our research, or we're arguing for some better solution to an existing problem, then you do have ideas. And so it's important to just commit to them in the writing and take a stance. Use active voice. That's really helpful to identify with the writing instead of passive voice. And if you're following APA 7 style, they're actually explicit now. They prefer for you to use like first person. And it makes it a lot easier to use active voice. And then there's also this aspect of getting comfortable with critically reading and evaluating literature. We'll talk about that. Following a top-down approach to your writing. Talk about that in a moment. And then using specific linguistic and rhetorical devices. So becoming familiar of these different moves that you can make in your writing by choosing the appropriate words based on the point that you want to make and the stance that you're taking. Let's take a deeper dive into these. First, let's talk about a top-down writing approach. So first of all, there's no, right or wrong here. The bottom-up approach can be just as effective. But I find that when you take the top-down approach, especially when you are kind of just getting started as a scholar, or maybe you've even recently graduated and you're writing your first publication and you're struggling with this idea of finding your voice, then taking a top-down approach just establishing those arguments from the beginning instead of looking in the evidence and then establishing the arguments just automatically gives you more of a sense of authority, because it feels like this is your idea and now you're going into the evidence, you're examining it, you're organizing it, you're critically evaluating it, and then you're situating your arguments that you came to this writing process with in relation to the evidence. So that's the top-down approach. Whereas the bottom-up approach is just as effective, but I find that when you start with the evidence and then develop your arguments, sometimes they don't feel like your ideas. I think the bottom-up approach is a lot easier to do when you're very familiar with the evidence available, and you can look at the evidence and start to develop your own ideas and arguments because you've been doing research within that discipline or within that field for maybe several years. So that's kind of the transition that I would say happens and becomes more effective in the writing process. So try that top-down approach, start with your own argument, and then go into the evidence and just see how that works for you. And then read critically. This is so important. I was just having this conversation with a client last week where he was really struggling with, he had a lot of data, a lot of evidence that he was looking at, and he just kept wanting to just report it. He wasn't really thinking critically about the limitations of some of the studies. He wasn't comparing the research to previous evidence or clinical guidelines. He was just kind of taking everything as fact and truth, and he wasn't really sitting with it and making new meaning out of it. And I find that it's a lot of people kind of want to take shortcuts, unfortunately. Like, we want to just download an article really quickly, and we don't really take the time to sit down and let it resonate with us, let it marinate rather, and think about what it means, and take time to think about what it means in relation to others' research. And if you don't do that, if you're kind of rushing that process and you're not taking the time to fully understand the research and critically evaluate it, then you're missing something. Your argument might not be, someone might be able to easily poke holes in your argument because you haven't really considered other perspectives. I think in healthcare research, it's a little easier to do this because healthcare researchers, we use critical appraisals to evaluate like experimental studies and random control trials. And so we learn to really critically appraise evidence. And that's not always the case in other disciplines. So I don't necessarily think you should teach yourself how to use a critical appraisal, but if this is something you're struggling with, I think it can develop your confidence in terms of critically appraising the evidence. And then taking a stance using linguistic and rhetorical devices. So these are just a few, and I have a handout on more of these. But using hedges, boosters, counters, or reformulating, using different terms, there's implications of using those words, and it can help you take a stance in your writing. So if you want to use caution, you might insert a word such as might or perhaps. Or if you want to emphasize, if you have certainty or conviction about a point you want to make, then you would insert the word certainly, maybe, or obviously. And so becoming familiar of these different linguistic and rhetorical devices will help you make a stance in your writing and kind of transition from what I see for many doctoral candidates is they use a neutral stance where they're really just describing the results of different studies. There's no sort of conviction. They're not trying to, you don't always have to try to persuade, but there's no stance there. And so it becomes really obvious when you look at an example. So I'm going to give you just a moment to read this to yourself. We have a purpose statement from a graduate student, and then this is a purpose statement and a published article from a more seasoned researcher. Let's start with the graduate student purpose statement. As you can see, I have it underlined here. This is where you can tell their stance. In the following critique, the article is examined in terms of ... You don't have to read the whole statement. This is very neutral. You can't really tell what the author is thinking. Their voice isn't coming through. They're definitely not taking a stance. But then let's look at this published purpose statement. In this critique, it is contended that Ross's study is flawed because in his two groups of learners, and then he goes on to say, neither distinct enough to have statistical measures applied to them, nor can he exclude other factors that may have influenced the findings. Notice how big of a difference there is there between this graduate student and this published author. This published author clearly is taking a stance. They have some opinions and some thoughts and ideas about this evidence that they're critiquing, and it comes through in their writing. You see this word contended, neither distinct enough, nor can he exclude. These are powerful linguistic and rhetorical devices that you can start implementing in your writing. And so it doesn't mean that you have to go in and revise all of your work to make it perfect, but hopefully now you're just becoming aware of maybe the stance that you're taking without even realizing it, and different ways to kind of go in and reconsider that stance and choosing different words and phrases that better reflect your intention in your writing. Let's talk about the next challenge. A lot of you mentioned this, loneliness and isolation. I think we can all, sympathize with this, especially during COVID, but let's just put COVID to the side. If you're in an online program, then you are most very likely feeling loneliness and isolation. There's actually quite a lot of research that shows that dropout rates are higher in fully online programs among doctoral students. And that's because of this social isolation, or a lot of, we can't pinpoint that it's only social isolation, but that is a big part of it. And we know that it can lead to loneliness, disconnectedness, self-doubt, even anxiety and depression. We know these things. There's a lot of research on this. And I think, unfortunately, there is this myth that writing is a solitary activity, and it's really not. Writing is a social practice. So I think if you can recognize that and take action, then you can start to combat this. And there's actually a lot of benefits to joining a writing community. There's quite a bit of research, accountability. If you're in a writing community where there's different levels of writers, where maybe if you're a doctoral candidate and there's early career faculty, or if you're early career faculty and there's more seasoned faculty, then you do start to get an increased awareness of different unspoken norms in academic writing, and you learn from those other levels of writers. You also learn different academic writing strategies and skills from others in the writing group or the writing community. Your confidence tends to increase. And then a bonus, at least in our writing community, is you tend to get feedback at different stages of the writing. Like, we provide real-time feedback in our writing workshops. And so joining a writing community or starting your own writing group within your program, where maybe you meet once a week for an hour or two, or even have some accountability practices with a peer, can make a big difference. All right, the planning fallacy. I think Ryan asked about this. So I found this cartoon. I think it's funny. We have two ghosts here, and one says, "Can you get the report to me by Friday?" The rational thing to do would be to recognize that it took over a week to develop the last report and suggest a week, and then you have a lovely Thursday evening. But then what we actually do is we overcommit. We say that we're going to do it, and then we have to say no to other important things and then rush through the process of completing this task. And that is the planning fallacy in a nutshell. And we know that this leads to a lot of things. I just have a few listed. We get anxiety. We start to feel overwhelmed. If you're like me, when I start to get too overwhelmed, I tend to want to shut down. We're rushed, and so our work tends to be sloppy. And then we also don't make the best decisions when we're rushing, when we're kind of in this position where we have to meet this deadline, where we've overcommitted ourselves. And so there's a couple of ways to address this, other than just the big old like time management and awareness, obvious answer. But I want you to consider thinking about a writing process, recognizing that writing is not linear, and it is very iterative, and it doesn't occur quickly in a vacuum where there's no other distractions. And so if you can start to think of what is your writing process, maybe it doesn't follow this exact cycle, and then creating a timeline for it. And I'll show you an example of a timeline in a moment. But this stage here, pre-writing, that's typically happening without you even realizing it. So it's not necessarily, like if you were me, I wouldn't necessarily sit down, okay, this is the pre-writing period. You're already doing that as you're preparing to write, as you're gathering literature and really clarifying your ideas. But then there is the planning stage. I highly recommend planning and scheduling time for it. And then drafting, and I think reflection is also important. So if you start to think of writing as this process that includes many steps, it's not just writing and editing or writing and then feedback, then you start to realize, okay, this is an extended time period that I need, and I'm not going to commit to writing this chapter or this draft to whoever it may be in a very rushed period of time. And so this is what that can look like, is a timeline. Create a timeline for yourself and then track your progress. I create timelines very frequently with my clients. I find it helpful for goal setting and accountability. But in thinking about combating this planning fallacy trap, if you start to list out your actual completion date, and then you can refer to that later to remind yourself. If someone asks you, if you, like, let's say you're a doctoral candidate and you start documenting how long it takes for you to write each chapter, then maybe a few years go by and you go into academia and you're writing a manuscript. That's going to take a completely different period of time. It's not as long. And so just tracking all of this can be helpful for you because it's a reminder of, this can't be rushed. I need to give myself adequate time. And then you can make more informed decisions when you're committing to deadlines. So I just have an example here of like if someone was writing their lit review, how they might break down the writing process, document target deadlines, and then document actual completion dates. So my screen jumped. Okay. Let me check the time. How are we doing that time? Good. Then we have feedback. I initially had fear of feedback, which was in the poll. But then I changed it because it's not just fear. There's all these feelings that come about with feedback. We can have feelings of resistance, feelings of inadequacy, anxiety, and then overwhelm when we actually get the feedback and we need to respond to it. And so what I hear the most frequently is this resistance, where a student will say, but this is my final draft. I thought I was done. Why am I getting this feedback? Or even me, when I was submitting manuscripts, I'd respond to the reviewer's comments, feel like I've done a great job. And then I get another round of comments. And then I get frustrated because I felt that the first round, I responded to them adequately. So resistance. And then there's anxiety about being evaluated. Sometimes that turns really, a lot of people I talk to will say, I can't even submit this draft. And so they get completely stuck. There's like paralyzed by this fear of having their professor or committee member or even a peer or a colleague review their writing and evaluate it. There's an emotional response. You received the feedback and you take it personally. You think it says something about you as a person. That can feel kind of awful. We all know, I think, what that feels like. And then overwhelmed. I think we've all been in this seat where we've received like extensive feedback and comments, and you just don't know where to start. You don't know how to prioritize it, and that can lead you to shutting down. In fact, I'd say one of the most common conversations I have with new clients is something along the lines of, well, I wrote this chapter and then I sent it to my committee to review. I received extensive comments and I just didn't know where to start. And so I just didn't touch it for 2 years or a year. I haven't made any progress. Now I don't even remember what my ideas were. I feel like I'm starting over. So that receiving of the feedback and then the overwhelm that came with it caused them to completely shut down. Same with articles. I know plenty of authors who submit a peer-reviewed article. They get the reviewer feedback, and it's so overwhelming that they just don't resubmit. That's also very common. And so I want to give you an action plan to help you like turn that fear and that overwhelm into action. We'll talk about that.
Hey, Jessica.
Yeah.
Also, this idea of feedback being personal.
Mm-hmm.
And how we respond to that. I know I see a lot of clients, and I too felt that way. And sometimes even on a journal article, I feel like they're attacking me, right? And so I think that's also maybe a little bit of a piece of these emotions that are tied to feedback.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And it's natural. There's nothing wrong. It doesn't mean anything about you. Like, don't then go judge yourself for having the emotional response. I think just being aware of it, that you're having this emotional response, is a good first step. And then if you're like me, I like to be able to channel that into action. I think having an action plan is important. But some of the common responses are rushing revisions. It's not really taking the time to reflect and think through the comments, or trying to work through the comments, the feedback from top to bottom within a document. Like if you've received feedback that's in track changes and comments throughout your Word document, a lot of people just try to start from top to bottom instead of attacking them strategically, and that can be really challenging, or just avoiding it altogether, like that story I told. Let's talk about a strategic approach to processing and responding to feedback. So one is develop an action plan, which I'll touch on. Another, and this is really important, is considering your mindset or your headspace when you're receiving feedback. And what I mean by this is if you're expecting reviewer feedback on a manuscript or your committee is sending you feedback on your proposal, don't open that email when you're about to go to bed, when you're walking into work first thing in the morning, when you're driving your car and you're at a stoplight, or if you're just exhausted and you're in a terrible mood, it's been an awful day, maybe that's not the best moment to sit down and open reviewer comments. So think about your headspace, put yourself in the best position possible to receive that feedback. View it as neutral, or I would even say positive. Viewing feedback as neutral is the advice that I received from someone several years ago, and it was really, really helpful. And it kind of takes you from this emotional response where you're perceiving it as a personal attack to recognizing that this is not personal, this is just neutral. Or I would even say positive, because someone is giving you a clue. They're telling you exactly what needs to be done in order to move forward. And so view it as neutral or positive, shift out of this like negative mindset. And then get organized, use a viewer response table. I'll show you an example of one of those if you're not familiar with what that is. Let's start with the action plan. I love this. I love being able to take action, especially when you have all these comments that you're trying to organize and prioritize. So I like to categorize the comments in these 3 ways. So I want you just to imagine you have a Word document and there's comments in the margins throughout this Word document. Going in and color coding, highlighting the comments so that every comment related to organization, which means it's a comment that will require you to reorganize that piece of writing, whether it be cutting and pasting the writing or rethinking the entire organization of the paper. It doesn't require you to add anything. It's just shifting, reorganizing the structure. And then content related comments, which is adding content, rethinking or expanding upon content, or going and double checking your sources to make sure the content is reported correctly. And then we have editing. So we have these 3 categories, and then going in and addressing one category at a time. I always recommend saving editing for last, but in terms of organization and content, I think it's nice to start with organization and then tackle the comments related to content, but sometimes it just doesn't work out that perfectly. You need to go back and forth. But in a perfect world, you could address organization and then content, and then you might have to go back in and reorganize some areas especially if you've added or taken away content, and then do the editing. And so addressing them strategically gives you this plan of attack. And then I highly recommend, especially if the comments are extensive, documenting your revisions and your responses in a reviewer response table. I want to give you kind of a highlight of what that looks like. This is a screenshot. This is for a manuscript where there's, I believe, 3 reviewers, and they create a table for each reviewer. So we have the reviewer comments on the left, and then the author's reply on the right. Let me see if we have time. I'm just going to open this up and show you a more extensive one. Veronica, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is what that document looks like. And you even have here, this person put in general comments, a general response, and then the individual replies within the table. And this is pretty extensive. There's a lot of reviewer comments here. I even love how they put the page number and the line number. And then when they transition to reviewer 2, it's a lot. They did it again. They have the general comments, kind of the general author response, and then the replies to the individual comments. I highly recommend doing this if you're not doing this already. Okay, let me stop sharing and go back to my presentation. 1 second. Okay, reviewer response table. All right, let's do a quick poll before we jump into the academic writing considerations. We're going to launch this poll. Among these very specific academic writing challenges, which do you experience most frequently? Do you struggle with organization flow, argumentation, alignment? Establishing novelty is just being able to establish the need for your study, why your study is important and new. Most people have, I'll give you just another second to answer. All share results. Okay, so most of you struggle with organization and flow. And then 30% argumentation, 5% alignment, and 20% establishing novelty. Interesting. I was not expecting that. I feel like alignment is something that comes up really, really frequently. Good. This is good to know. Okay. So I won't spend a ton of time on alignment. All right. Organization and flow. So what we frequently see in the writing when someone is struggling, when it's a challenge to organize their writing and make sure it flows, is there's a lack of external and internal writing structure, and or there's unclear connections between ideas at the paragraph and sentence level. So that paragraph unity is lacking, and that interrupts the flow of the writing. And so obviously a well-organized paper, I think we all kind of have something in mind in terms of what that looks like. It's important to think about these different features. There are predictable writing patterns that you can follow. And I think a lot of people forget that. They just want to start writing from top to bottom without really thinking about a structure or a pattern that they can use in their writing. And a well-organized paper also is guiding the reader. So you're kind of writing with your reader in mind. It also conveys focus and intent and establishes expectations, which is really, really important. I find that we don't have time to go into it this evening, but there can be a real disconnect between the writer and the reader when there's poor organization and flow, because the reader, your audience, has specific expectations. And when your paper is well organized, especially when it's following these predictable patterns of writing, then you're much more likely to meet the audience's expectations. So organizational writing patterns, these are just a few. If you're not familiar with these different writing patterns, I highly recommend taking the time to familiarize yourself with them. I truly believe it will make your life a lot easier, especially the next time you're getting writer's block and you're just really not sure how to start or how to organize your ideas. Go through and look at these writing patterns and think about the purpose of your writing and the argument that you're trying to make. Or if you're not making an argument and you're just describing a process, then obviously you can follow a process pattern. Or if you're just describing a timeline of events, you can follow a chronological pattern. But there are lots of organizational patterns in academic writing, and they're there for you to use. And so familiarize yourself with them and the purpose of these different patterns and employ them in your writing. It will make your writing flow better, and it'll read better. I'm going to share this handout with you. I'm just going to click on it for a moment. So you can see these different organizational patterns in academic writing and how to identify them. It shows the purpose of the pattern and signal words. This is a handout that I will send you with the recording of the webinar. Go back to the presentation. Okay, improving flow. This goes along with organization. It's hard to have flow when the writing isn't organized. So when we're writing as academics, the writing is typically complex. We have these layered ideas, all these different relationships need to be communicated and established for the reader. And sometimes that can be, not sometimes, a lot of times it's very, very challenging. So taking the time, kind of going back to the writing process, to really plan the writing, thinking about what organizational pattern is going to work best for what I want to say, for the purpose of this writing. And then going and thinking about the internal structure of the writing and the flow of that writing. And so thinking about topic sentences is important. creating a topic sentence outline would be a great way to kind of try to make sure that you have flow in your writing. Also using the known to new contract, which I think Veronica exposed me to that. Even though logically I understand it, but I didn't know that's what it was called. It's called known to new. I'll show you that handout in a moment. But it's where you're consistently moving from kind of old information or the previous information to new information, and you're constantly linking back in the sentences. And I'll show you what that looks like. I'm a visual person. Being intentional about the transitional phrases that you're using to indicate relationships between ideas. And then repetition, that's huge. And that also goes in with alignment, which I'll talk about in a moment, but repeating important keywords and concepts, even repeating the subjects and nouns in a sentence are different ways to improve flow. Let's take a quick look at known to new. Again, I'll give you this handout. This is by Carnegie Mellon University. And it's all about the known new contract is where you have a known idea in the beginning of the sentence, and then the next sentence links the known idea and the new idea. So you're just kind of going back from this topic to stress position. And they have examples here, which I think are really helpful, where they help you identify the stress position and then the topic position, and then put old information in the topic and new information in the stress position. And I think these examples are great. And they also have these different phrases that can help you kind of link these ideas together. So I'll definitely share that with you. And I think it's worth taking a look at if this is something that you struggle with. If you've been told that you need to improve the flow of your writing, then that could be something that helps you. Okay, argumentation. So you might not realize it, but most academic writing is some form of an argument. And when you're not thinking that way, if you're not intentionally thinking about what is my thesis, what is the argument that I want to put forth, then it shows up in your writing. Sometimes it shows up as like poorly organized writing, or as like neutral writing, where you're not quite sure if the author has a take or an idea or a voice or an opinion on the matter. And so it often manifests as when you're not thinking about argumentation, you're not being intentional, it often manifests as too many main ideas, or the main idea is really poorly defined. You're not actually sure what the main idea is, or the evidence being presented doesn't actually align or connect to the main idea, or there's no counter arguments or opposing views. Or if there are, maybe they don't actually seem to logically connect to the argument being put forth. And so that's what poor argumentation often manifests as. And there's ways you can go about addressing it. And one is, just like I said, that there are organizational writing patterns, there are known ways, known methods for structuring your argument. So just broadly, you're developing a claim, you're providing evidence to support the claim, and then you're addressing counter arguments or objections. And so these different terms, this idea of claim and evidence and counter arguments, those are commonly used in these different methods, the Toulmin, Rogerian, and classical methods. There are other argumentation methods for developing academic arguments, but those are 3 common ones, and they're covered on the Purdue Writing Lab website. So I think become familiar with those if that's something that you're struggling with and you want to work on improving your process of developing an argument, and it goes along well with improving the organization of your writing, is you're kind of following this writing structure. Then we have alignment. I'm going to take a sip of water. Okay, so alignment is it's the logical connection of ideas presented. I have a research proposal, but it's really any sort of academic document. And it's actually one of the most common reasons why a research proposal is not approved. And I put this is a presentation I've done quite a bit with doctoral candidates, but it's still applicable with an article. Usually, once you get to the stage where you're publishing, you have a better idea of how to use the correct terminology to make sure that your language is aligned. So we tend to see this very frequently in doctoral candidates who are writing a proposal, who are really just learning the ropes of understanding the correct terminology and then using the correct terms when describing their research. So when we're thinking about improving alignment, there's two considerations. There's only one that I can address tonight. First consideration is correct research terminology. That involves having a knowledge and understanding of your research methods, your methodology, your design, and that's not something I can teach you tonight. But another aspect of it is your word choice. So let's say you're conducting, I'll give you an example. Let's say you're conducting a IPA study. Then in your purpose statement, in your research questions, in your problem statement, you're going to use terms that are aligned with an IPA research design. So a lot of IPA studies are about making meaning, about lived experiences. So you wouldn't expect to see language about cause and effect or the impact or the evaluation of an intervention. That would not align with the terminology associated with a phenomenological and IPA design. So that's what I mean by alignment. So first, you have to have an in-depth understanding. You have to have knowledge of what you're writing about. So let's just assume that that's there. Then it's choosing the right words and consistently using the right terms. A common issue that we see is where someone's writing their purpose statement from memory instead of copying and pasting. And so there's all these different iterations of their purpose statement, and it's really confusing. So just do yourself a favor and copy and paste your purpose statement throughout your document. That will avoid confusion and it'll solve a lot of issues with alignment that's being picked up in the writing. And then consistently using identical terms. So word variation is not your friend here. You want to stick to the exact same terms that you're using to describe your key concepts, your variables, your target population, your sample, and your research methodology, design, and method. Again, a simple example of this would be, in terms of staying away from word variation, is if you're consistently calling your survey instrument a survey, and then suddenly you switch to say questionnaire, even though you might mean the same thing, your reader might suddenly think that there's a different method being implemented in the study. They don't realize it's the same as a survey. So just that tiny little change can cause confusion, and it might very well likely your reviewer, especially if it's a committee member or your professor, will come back and say that there is an alignment issue. And you can use an alignment checklist. I don't have time to show it, but I'll send it out. And it's a checklist that we created to help you just assess the alignment in your writing. It's pretty detailed, and it's really just a reminder of what you're looking for in these different components of a proposal, like purpose statement, research questions, problem statement, lit review, theoretical framework, all that good stuff. Okay, we're almost done. Establishing novelty. So this is just showing how your work is important, relevant, and new. And a common pitfall here is presenting the research as an interest without establishing the need. And I get this a lot, where someone will say, well, I want to study this because of X, Y, and Z. And they don't present it as research that is needed. They don't speak to the significance. They don't tell me why I should care. So it's important to establish that need in order to establish novelty. Or something I also frequently see is when someone says, there's no research on this, and that's the gap. And so my study is needed. That is, again, not a way to establish novelty. You still have to establish the need for your study, and you can still say that there is a gap, there's a dearth of evidence, but you have to establish the significance and present the need of your study before you just jump in and say that the evidence isn't there. And so this is what we see again and again in the writing of doctoral students and novice researchers. But I think even seasoned researchers can struggle with this, especially when you're really immersed in your field and you've been conducting research on the same topic for a long time. You can start to make assumptions that, of course, my reader or my audience understands the need. I don't need to establish this. Again, this is so important. But that's because you live and breathe that type of research. You always have to establish the need for your research. And there's some ways that you can do that. So again, I have a handout on this, but these are 4 rhetorical moves for establishing novelty. So one is explaining your significance. And there's more on this in the handout. So why your audience should care. And in this handout, it recommends going beyond just the target audience, being able to just kind of generalize the significance if possible. And then transitioning to describing the status quo. So what are the current practices? And then identifying a gap by showing how the current practices are unsatisfactory. And then filling that gap with your research. And there's a couple of ways to do that. You could present a new theory or hypothesis, a new solution, a new methodology, or a new domain. And so these are kind of 4 things that you can need to make sure that you're doing in order to establish novelty. And this handout, which I'll click on, does that. It gives you a little more information here. And I think that it's really helpful. So I'll make sure that you, oh, this is the wrong document. This is the abstract. I'll make sure I get you the correct one. The one for establishing novelty even has examples within the, actually, click on it here. No, I just have it labeled wrong. I'm sorry. I'll make sure you have the correct one because it has examples of each of these sections of writing, and I think it's really useful. Oh, wow. Okay, so that was the end of the different challenges, the strategies that you can implement in your writing to get unstuck. I will definitely send you all of those handouts. And if that's all you wanted to hear about this evening, then you're free to go. But if you are interested in learning about the Academic Writing Center, I'm just going to share a little bit of information about that.
Hey, Jessica, before
yeah.
you transition to that,
Yeah.
one of the questions that I think is maybe good to have your take on it, I responded, but is the surrounding active voice, like what I explained what it is, but maybe you could talk a little bit about why it's important.
Yeah.
And kind of, I know that some universities even now are demanding that there's not a whole lot of passive voice in the writing, which makes it a struggle a little bit sometimes. So we do have to have kind of a mix of passive and active.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know. So whatever you think there, I just pointed out what passive voice was, and then gave it someone else gave an example of it. So
Oh, good. Yeah. So I disagree. We're kind of getting more and more clients who come to us and they say, well, I had to eliminate all passive voice, or even they'll hire one of our editors and they'll say, I tried to eliminate all passive voice, but I don't know if I got everything. Can you double check? And the reality is you can't eliminate all of it. You're constantly juggling like passive and active voice. You're juggling first person, you're juggling anthropomorphism. And some of these things are interrelated. And so when you change one, it changes the other. So you can't perfectly present a paper that doesn't have any anthropomorphism, no passive voice, only first person. It can be difficult, but I used to struggle a lot with passive voice. And so it's part of my revision checklist. And one of the things that I do to try to identify it, because it's not something I worry about when I'm writing, is I do a find and search for ing words. Because typically when you're using passive voice, there's a lot of ing. I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head. I was even doing it when I was working on this presentation. I was saying things like, well, establishing novelty. That's ing. Improving alignment, like putting that's obviously just 2 words. It's not a sentence, but when you're transitioning to active voice, you want to have the subject at the beginning of the sentence and they're doing the verb. And so then instead of saying, you can transition from passive to active. I'm trying to think of some better examples off the top of my head, but ing words are typically great ways to identify passive voice, but it's really, I don't think it's possible to get rid of all passive voice in a document. I think it makes a document really hard to read if it's just all active voice. And then it also depends on exactly what you're writing. So I'm sorry, I know that's not like a perfect answer.
No, that was good. And could you go ahead and show the establishing novelty page one more time? Some people wanted to take a look at that again.
Yeah. This page?
No, the novelty. Or that, well, maybe it was that page. Sorry, I didn't realize they were connected. Yeah.
Yeah, I have the wrong document linked here. Otherwise, I would pull that up because it has examples. But
Oh yeah, and somebody said, can they have both? So they liked the one that they saw too.
yeah, that one was specifically for abstracts. But yeah, there's one with, it has this same information, but then it has examples of the writing, which I think is great. Were there any other?
Nope, that was it so far.
Is it? Good. Good. Well, what I was about to say is these are all topics we address in our workshops at the Academic Writing Center. The establishing novelty piece was something we addressed in a workshop on Tuesday. We talk about really everything we talked about tonight. We're having workshops on once a week. We record all of them and we keep them in an on-demand library, which looks like this. So you can go in and sort the topics. You can watch the workshop. You can download the resources. We also have writing retreats once a week. And then if you need it, you can hire a writing coach if you want one-to-one writing support. And I do think it's very affordable. It's $99 a month, and that gets you about 8 workshops and retreats a month. And then after your second month, you can get one 60-minute writing coaching session, which is included in your community membership payment, in addition to all of the resources and the workshops and the retreats. So if this is something you are interested in trying out, I'm looking at the time, so I'll skip this. You can get your first month for $19 with this promo code. You just go to theacademicwritingcenter.com and you click on join. And if you sign up for a month-to-month membership and you enter this code, you'll save $80. And then you can pause or cancel at any time. There's no long-term commitment or contract. And Veronica and I teach writing sessions frequently. I'm teaching one this Saturday on how to manage the supervisor-student relationship, certain best practices that I'll share. And then we'll be meeting again every Tuesday and every Saturday for the rest of the year. So I hope that I'll see you there. I'll also be hosting another webinar in January for non-native English speakers, improving their academic English. So stay tuned for that webinar. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.